He promised that he would get these amazing deals, he would open up new markets. He largely hasn't done that. Just about every deal he's done with everyone else has been very tokenistic. It's been full of very, very large numbers that don't mean anything.
Now, US and European stock markets wobbled yesterday, it's fair to say, amid fears that President Donald Trump's tariffs are damaging the US economy. Now, after reaching 2 trade deals with the UK and the European Union earlier this week, during his trip to Scotland, Donald Trump announced a raft of new tariffs on more than 60 countries, including 25% on Indian exports, 39% on Swiss goods, and an increase from 25 to 35% on products from Canada, which has taken immediate effect. Well, joining us now is Dmitry Grozoubinski, trading negotiations expert and author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade. Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dmitry, I've got to ask, why Swiss goods at 39%? Does Sweden upset the president? Switzerland upset the president?
Perhaps Sweden has also upset him.
Well, we don't know.
Together, IKEA furniture has a bone to pick. I think there are a couple of explanations people have been throwing around, but the two that are leading is that since the start of Trump's term, Swiss exports to the US have actually increased. The trade surplus has grown. Now, a huge amount of that is driven by a weird thing about gold. Basically, Switzerland's one of the only places on Earth that has the technology to very precisely convert the gold bars that are standard in one part of the world into a size that's standard in another. And so they export a ton of gold, but they're not actually like generating any gold. They're just processing it. So basically, Switzerland started selling more stuff to the US because demand surged for gold. And so that meant that the US trade deficit with Switzerland grew, and he didn't like that. Secondly, they were apparently in negotiations, and they had a framework for a deal, but it sounds like the US was seeking more concessions from the Switzerland to open up its market in a bunch of ways it wasn't prepared to. And so negotiations fell apart, and they got hit with even higher tariffs than they saw in April.
Dmitry, so far, the president's tariffs, are they working for the US economy? He seems to insist that they are good for the economy. There's the continuing argument of who actually pays for the tariffs, but we know that it's the US companies importing things and the US consumer that has to pay for them. But are they working for Donald Trump? Is he managing to actually negotiate better deals for the US, as arguably many say he has done with the EU? He's managed to get a deal that benefits the US. So has the tariff policy, if you like, worked for the Donald Trump administration?
It's a really complicated question, and I want to be really fair and sort of systematic and work through where it is and isn't succeeding. So it is succeeding in some ways by Trump's own definition. It is raising money. Mm-hmm. Now, most of that money is coming from US consumers. It's a new tax on Americans, but that tax is raising billions of dollars. There is more money in the Treasury than there was before, so it's working in that regard. The US has largely avoided retaliation, apart from a brief kind of fight with the Chinese, where they ended up very quickly coming back to the table. Virtually no one else has retaliated. So the US has been able to tax imports from everyone in the world, and the rest of the world has not retaliated by taxing imports from the US. So it's been a kind of one-sided thing. So that is working as well, Trump's definition. It's also brought people to the table. So almost everyone on Earth, and certainly just about every major economy that has been threatened with tariffs, has come to the US and said, let's talk about what we can do here. What would you need in order to not hit us quite so hard or not to hit us at all? So in those ways, it's working. It doesn't seem to be working in a couple of other ways. He promised that he would get these amazing deals, he would open up new markets. He largely hasn't done that. Just about every deal he's done with everyone else has been very tokenistic. It's been full of very, very large numbers that don't mean anything on investment and defense. But in terms of Americans being able to sell things to places they couldn't before, hasn't really succeeded in that at all. And the latest jobs and GDP numbers would suggest that some tariffs, the uncertainty around tariffs, and a number of other factors have really hurt the American economy in the short term. People are not investing. Manufacturing has slowed down a bit. And jobs performance has been abysmal these last couple of months.
Is it sustainable, Dmitry? Do you think these high prices that US consumers have to pay and US importers are paying, can it sustain itself for the entirety of Donald Trump's tenure in the White House?
So my instinctive reaction is no, and we should say that mostly the price increases haven't even really started yet. Those in the US who sort of import a lot from abroad, when this whole thing started, they began by front-loading a lot of their inventory. They bought up a bunch of stuff before the
stocking
tariff
up, basically, before the tariffs hit.
And then most of the tariffs were suspended over this 90-day period over the last 3 months. After so-called Liberation Day, he immediately reduced everything down to 10% and said, we're going to negotiate. So in many ways, the tariffs haven't really even kicked in yet, and they're certainly not being hugely reflected on supermarket shelves. Once that starts happening, if you combine that with anemic job growth, anemic rates of FDI, then I think it becomes hard to imagine it being sustained. With that said, I should sort of caution that because all of this is being driven from the White House, because he can sort of unilaterally do a lot of these things, he has a lot of ability to kind of ease the pressure in individual places. You know, quite literally, if T-shirt prices go up too high, he can make an exemption for T-shirts. And he can buy himself a lot of time by doing these sort of spot fixes and exemptions, as we've already seen him start doing.
I mean, that does sort of teach us that there is a benefit to being able to be so immediate and not move at the glacial pace that we see with other trade deals that take years to negotiate. Do you think that this is sort of changing the way that countries are going to be doing trade deals in the future, or is this something that is going to stay purely unique to Donald Trump?
I don't necessarily think it's going to transform the way most countries approach trade for a couple of reasons. First, the trade-off has always been agility versus long-term predictability and stability, right? That has always been why we do trade agreements to begin with. It's to give investors and the people who build supply chains and factories assurances that this is what trade will look like 5 years from now. You can start building a factory that won't start to make money for 4 years because you have that confidence. And that sort of equation still holds. And then secondly, most countries simply are not as large, economically powerful, and certainly not as large a final consumer as the United States. The US consumer spends more than anyone else on Earth per capita by a considerable margin. The average American household spends something like a third more than the average German household. That gives the US a huge amount of weight to throw around in order to sort of take advantage of this agility and unpredictability in a way that a smaller economy, even a large and sort of important one like the UK, it simply doesn't have that same kind of muscle. And so predictability is more attractive.
Dmitry, fascinating as always to speak with you. Dmitry Grozoubinski, there, trade negotiations expert and author of the brilliant Why Politicians Lie About Trade.